more than 80% of companies that look to expand internationally, and this is whether it's US going abroad or foreign companies coming into the US, they fail because they don't take the time to understand the dynamics of the market that they're going into well enough to be successful from a sales perspective.
Welcome to Scale Like a CEO, the podcast where we dive deep into the strategies and insights of successful business leaders. Today, we have an incredible conversation lined up with Matt DiMarsico, an expert in international business expansion and scaling companies globally. Get ready for valuable insights on building successful cross-border operations and leading high-performing teams. Let's jump right in.
Matt, thank you so much for joining me on Scale Like a CEO. Would love to hear a little bit about your background and your business.
Great to be here, Justin. Appreciate it. I've spent the last quarter century building and scaling sales and marketing competencies for what I term disruptive tech companies. Now, that definition's obviously changed over time, and what was once disruptive is now much more commonplace, but the tenets of the definition stay the same, right? These are technologies that really do change the way we work, the way we interact with each other, and the way the world runs. In that time, I've been very fortunate. I've had multiple exits and acquisitions. The unique part of that was 4 different times I've been acquired by foreign enterprises that have tasked me with bringing their portfolios into the US. So I've been able to build a really interesting playbook around internationalization and global expansion. That's now led me to what I do today, which is working at USA Launching Pad, where we help foreign companies expand into the US market.
And so in that realm of the business you're in today, what's the biggest problem you see in that industry or in that segment that you're solving?
What I see more than anything is, there's always a desire to move quickly, and oftentimes at the sake of understanding the market and understanding the customer well enough to be successful. More than 80% of companies that look to expand internationally, and this is whether it's US going abroad or foreign companies coming into the US, they fail because they don't take the time to understand the dynamics of the market that they're going into well enough to be successful from a sales perspective. Many companies look to hire, the savior, the one salesperson that's going to bring them, the entry into the market and all the customers they need. You need to step back. You need to ask the right questions. You need to understand how people buy within whatever culture you're moving into, how they interpret your value proposition, not the other way around. And that then becomes the baseline and the foundation of how then you do everything else surrounding the sales function to make it successful. How you build collateral, how you A/B test messaging, how you find the right people to hire, because now you understand the ICP much better and the buyer personas and the vertical markets interpretation of what you do. And so that generally is the biggest mistake is, rush to get in without doing enough of the heavy lifting to understand the market dynamics.
I think that cultural competence is so undervalued. Almost every business I've worked in had a global presence. There was one in particular, a private equity firm in Singapore that had acquired a US-based business, but then was trying to run it just like they would run any of their other businesses. There was such a disconnect in the way that people were, just experiencing their work and what they expected. It ended up not being successful and they divested the business. I've totally been through when that does not work well.
Yeah, you kind of nailed it. Management styles are unique, culture to culture. Expectations are different from both customers and internal resources about how you engage, how much you communicate, what you communicate. Cultural understanding is a significant cornerstone of geographic expansion success.
Yeah. If you look at your business today and as you've been growing, what are some of the challenges that you've faced in starting it at one and continuing to build the team?
There's a saying, and we can debate whether it's true or not, but there's a saying that A players hires A players and B players hire C players. And, one of the things for me is leaders need to be self aware. They need to understand where their superpowers lie, what are their competencies, and where they need to augment to with a team around them to really get results. From a sales and marketing perspective, I've been doing that for a very long time. I recognize that I don't have I'm a little ADD, right? So, I need someone with a little more discipline than myself in that area to make sure that the deliverables get done in a way that leads to the successful growth of the company, and being specific in prioritizing those hires one at a time, especially as a small team. I mentioned earlier, I've had the fortunate experience in my career to be acquired by very large companies where time, money, and resources were flowing at a higher capacity than with a smaller company. If you need 5 people, you get 5 people. As a smaller company, if you're going to hire 5 people, they need to be really, really good at delivering the things that the company needs at that point, at that time, to move to the next level. And for us, a lot of that was, we needed data scientists early on to build the internal software platform that enabled us to provide the services that we provided in a way that translated both visually and from an informational perspective to our customers, right? This is where you have to trust a bit of your instinct in hiring a role that you don't specifically do yourself and do well. So how do you interview a data scientist? How do you evaluate their work in a way that gives you an understanding of whether they're competent or not? And then when they join the team, how do you make sure you're managing them in a way that both stimulates them and gives them enough care to feel understood, heard, and productive? Those two things, I think, are the cornerstones of building the team. Knowing where your competencies are less proficient and augmenting with those, and then really prioritizing what the organization needs at that time to meet your next growth objective.
Yeah, I like your statement around A players hire A players. It makes me think about many years ago, I worked at a company called Big Machines, which was Godard Abel's first company that he founded. You might recognize
Okay.
Godard from the CEO of G2, the software
Uh-huh.
review
Mm-hmm.
company. And so I remember when I was hired by Godard, he would say, we've been building this business, and every time I hire someone, I'm hiring somebody better than myself and better than the last. And it was something to that effect, right? He
Yeah.
was always like, I just want to keep up leveling. We're just going to keep getting better. I'm not the best person we're going to have on board. And I think that awareness that I'm not going to be an expert at everything. And so I need to hire people that are the experts. I think that's great. And it's interesting because I also talk to some founders that will say, I actually want to do the job before I hire for the role. So I understand what the job is and so I can do it. And I think some things you can do that with, but others like data science, if you didn't study it, you're never going to be an amazing data scientist. So just go find one,
Yeah.
you
And
know?
if you ever dabbled in data science, there's a lot of cleansing of tables. When you are knee deep in a table of columns and rows that can make your eyes blur, you do need a specific type of person that has the discipline to be able to do that. And I agree. I believe you need to have an understanding of the role, but being able to do it adds unnecessary boundaries around what I can hire. Having worked in enterprise organizations, the specificity in skill sets is so broad and varied. To think that you'd be able to do it yourself is a little naive.
Yeah.
That's how I interpret it.
Yeah, it can be challenging for sure. I'm curious within your team, one of the conversations I've been having with someone recently is I think 2 years ago, everybody recognizes that we saw that investors were putting lots of money into companies and they were hiring ahead of probably what they needed to. And now we've seen a lot of layoffs because of that. I'm curious, as you're growing your business, how do you get that right? How do you know that you're hiring people that you can likely keep. I know there's no guarantees, right? Your marketplace could go sideways and you've got to make some hard decisions. But if you're scaling appropriately in a market that's working, how do you know when you can keep hiring?
Uh, there's a straight line answer to revenue and cash flow,
Mhm.
but I do think there's some alignment to what type of company you are. And if you are funded, I have been in meetings where, I've at companies that were fund backed by VCs, and they said, if I wanted the money in the bank, I would have put it in the bank, spend the money. Even when you're trying to sort of manage burn rate and being considerate on your hires when you need to, sometimes there are other external factors that are forcing your hand to hire more quickly than you'd like. I'm giving
Mhm.
entrepreneurs a little bit of a pass there because I've been in those meetings, and sometimes you just hire because that's what you're supposed to do when you get venture capital money
Mhm.
to try to scale and grow as quickly as you can. That said, I think the prudent thing to do is go back to those metrics: revenue, cash flow, and a really good handle on pipeline. When you understand your sales metrics, your conversion rates, and you understand, all of those dimensions that lead to revenue well enough, you can make projections and then hire in advance, right, to actually be able to support the growth. That has been for me, especially given my background in sales and marketing, that understanding of the dynamics of the pipeline. Every company has unique dynamics. I worked for a company, and one of the most interesting things about the pipeline was we found over time that only 8% what we shipped was actually turned on in the first 12 months. It's a very interesting number, right? If you
Yeah.
shipped 100 widgets, 8 would be used. Now, over time, all of the inventory got used. But when you're thinking about the impact to revenue, understanding that was really critical to understanding the impact to shorter term revenue and being able to make the right call on hires and hiring. And, you know, in a small company, you'll know this. There's always you can always use more staff. It's just people, there's so much to do. People wear multiple hats, but being considerate to back to our original point, right? What is gonna make the most impact to your growth objectives, and how are you going to afford it in the long term are key.
Yeah. And I think those two things are important. I think the revenue thing, being able to track that, that being a straight line, but then knowing, all right, so if I'm going to hire one more person, what's the impact that they're going to have on revenue and the growth of the business? I've seen so many times, I can even think of a business that I was in, like we would close a deal and everybody knew like, oh, we just closed this deal and we know
Mm-hmm.
how much revenue there is. Time to go talk to the CEO and get a piece of that. Like, I want to hire this, I want to buy this.
Mm-hmm.
There were some interesting decisions that were made around how you're lobbying for that. And I think you've got to really have a solid plan in place of understanding impact on
Yeah.
those decisions.
Yeah, and I think some products, some services and solutions are a little more straightforward, right? You're a SaaS product, you sell licenses, you know what it's. Sometimes you can get the licenses, the fees in advance. Awesome, right? And then
Hmm.
you can allocate differently. But to your point, every organization is going to be vying for a little piece of that. You look at implementation and customer success; they're going to be the first ones hit by this big deal that you closed. And they're like, how are we going to do this? We need more people. And you just roll that through the rest of the organization. As a leader, you really do have to step back and say, what aligns with my growth objectives? What's going to make the
Hmm.
most impact in the organization to meet those objectives? And that's where you need to hire. Sometimes it's all hands on deck. Sometimes you've got a smaller team and everybody's got to do a little bit to assist when the whale comes in. I've had CEOs in my past who have done what I'll consider the grunt work just to get things done because you had deadlines to meet and you had customers expecting things, and everybody's hands had to be getting dirty at some
Yeah,
point. Yeah,
for sure.
yeah.
So, one more thing that I want to talk about then is now, let's say you've got your team, you're building your team, and things are growing, and you can't be the only one leading the ship. You've got to start to build your bench of leaders. How have you gone about that, or how are you going about it currently to identify and grow those leaders?
So, not unlike most of us, right? A trusted network and personal references really do go a long way, right?
Mhm.
Oftentimes, you've got to go to the market to find people. A strong interviewing skill set is key um, in really being able to identify the qualities in an individual that work. Now, there's the hard skills, right? I'll go back to sales and marketing. Fine, you've sold things, right? But then there's soft skills, there's communication skills, there's empathy, right? And as a salesperson, these are things that I've learned over time are very important in the sales process. There's discipline to sales, and how do you interview and qualify for that? Especially when you're talking about a leader, you have to be able to identify the qualities of that leader that are not only going to fit your culture, because every company has a bit of a unique culture. If there's a mismatch of culture fit, I don't care how good of a resource you are, you're going to be challenged. Being able to ensure that there's enough care and feeding early on to develop the resource to be independent and competent, because anybody that's going to come in is going to need a decent amount of exposure and support to be able to do the right things in the job. Ideally, for me, when you get that flywheel going, developing internal is the best way to go. I mean, build a bench, train and support, enable from a sales perspective, enablement, training and development continually, right? That really does then, help to build a bench that then you can avoid. I've got to spend a few months ramping up on the people, the processes, and the tools that you're using. For a small company, you don't have the bench. You generally have to go outside. Being able to step back in the same way that I talked about earlier, companies understand the culture and the geographies that they're going into, understand what you want from the role, what you need in the roles that you're hiring, and be very simplistic in writing those characteristics down. Everybody's got ChatGPT these days. Go to ChatGPT and ask, how should I evaluate this characteristic in an interview? And ask the questions. And that's really the best way I've found to do it.
Great. And I really like what you talk about with developing internal talent. I think that's where they're going to fit. They've got the background that they need to continue to scale. So when you
Right.
can do that, it's so critical. So one final question, what's your vision for USA Launching Pad as you grow into the future?
There's the ultimate goal, bi-directional competency. We've built great partnerships with global companies to provide our framework and our methodology, not only to foreign companies coming into the US, but any company going to any new geography, right? And so, this is it's a the tech market is huge. There's a lot of focus in multiple countries around the world to support their startup ecosystem, and our ultimate goal is to be engaged globally, doing exactly what we do today for foreign companies entering the US.
Great. Well, Matt, thank you so much for joining me. If people want to get in touch with you, what's the best way?
You can find me on LinkedIn, Matt DiMarsico, or info@usalaunchingpad.com. I'll make sure I engage. And thank you, Justin. This is always a pleasure doing these types of things.
Thank you so much. I enjoyed the conversation.
Bye now.